The vast desert stretched endlessly beneath the glare of a fading sun. In the sky above, a strange shadow passed across the clouds, followed by the unmistakable sound of engines, smooth, humming, alien. A massive craft broke through the atmosphere, descending slowly, its sleek metallic surface shimmering in the orange glow of Earth's twilight. The ship, as large as a city block, hovered silently before landing in the middle of the desert, displacing clouds of dust with a gentle pulse. The Zerathians had arrived. These were no ordinary visitors. The Zerathians were an all-female race of warriors, known throughout the galaxy for their unmatched combat skills and strict discipline. Towering over most humans, their athletic, armored bodies were crafted for battle, each movement precise and deliberate. Their pale blue skin shimmered under the sun, contrasting against the dark, high-tech armor that hugged their forms. Despite their outward beauty, there was no mistaking their strength. The galaxy feared them for good reason. At the forefront of the group stood General Serena, the leader of the Zerathian strike force. She was taller than the rest, her deep violet eyes surveying the desert with a mixture of disdain and amusement. Behind her, the warriors lined up in formation, silent and ready, their weapons at the ready, as if expecting an enemy to emerge from the barren landscape. "So, this is Earth?" Serena's voice, clear and sharp, cut through the stillness. She stepped forward, her gaze sweeping the endless horizon. What a pitiful excuse for a planet. I had heard stories, but I didn't think it would be this. Primitive. Her second in command, Lyra, stood beside her, arms crossed, an almost bored expression on her face. She flicked her long, dark hair over her shoulder as she eyed the distant mountains. The Galactic Council must be joking. They want us to conquer this? I've seen colonies with more fight in them than this planet. Serena smirked, amusement dancing in her eyes. Humans are weak, she said. They're not like us. Their technology is outdated, their tactics laughable. If it weren't for the Council's orders, we wouldn't even need to set foot here. But orders are orders. She glanced back at her warriors. This will be over before it even begins. Lyra snorted. I almost feel bad for them. Almost. The Zerathians had been dispatched by the Galactic Council to establish an outpost on Earth, a planet they considered low risk, barely worth their attention. The humans, in their view, were little more than a minor obstacle, a species still crawling towards technological advancement. The Council's orders were clear: secure the planet for future use, and move on to more pressing matters. Serena raised her arm, signaling her warriors to fan out and secure the area. As they moved with practiced precision, Serena activated a holographic map from a device on her wrist. The outpost would be built here, in the middle of this desolate wasteland, far from human civilization. No one would notice until it was too late. Just as the Zerathians began to unpack their advanced equipment, a sudden noise broke the silence. A distant rumble, faint at first, but growing louder. Serena's eyes narrowed as she turned toward the sound. From behind the dunes, vehicles appeared, human military vehicles, small and crude by Zerathian standards, but fast. Soldiers. Two were visible, though their armor and weapons seemed more suited for a museum than a battlefield. A wry smile spread across Serena's lips. Well, it seems we have company. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with excitement. Do we engage? General? Serena nodded slowly, watching the human forces approach. Yes, but make it quick. Show them what real warriors look like. The Zerathians moved into position with the grace of predators, their advanced weapons humming to life. They didn't bother taking cover. There was no need. They were superior in every way, and they knew it. The human soldiers, led by Sergeant Jackson, came to a halt a few hundred meters away. Jackson, a seasoned veteran, had never seen anything like the Zerathians before. He could tell immediately that they weren't here to negotiate. These were enemies, strong ones. As the human soldiers fanned out and took up defensive positions, Jackson's second in command, Private Harris, glanced nervously at the approaching alien warriors. What are those things, Sarge? Jackson tightened his grip on his rifle, eyes narrowing. Trouble. Big trouble. The air between the two forces grew tense as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. The Zerathians stood tall, their weapons shimmering in the twilight, While the human soldiers braced for what they knew would be a difficult battle, Serena raised her weapon, its energy crackling with a power far beyond anything Earth's military had ever seen. Let's show them why they should fear us. The first shot rang out, signaling the start of the battle. The Zerathians charged, their speed and agility catching the humans off guard. Energy blasts tore through the air, and the human soldiers scrambled to return fire. But Jackson wasn't about to let his squad fall without a fight. Using the terrain to his advantage, he ordered his men to dig in and focus their fire on the flanking Zerathians. The battle had begun, but as the dust settled and the first shots were fired, it became clear that this would not be the quick and easy victory the Zerathians had expected. Serena watched from the front lines, her eyes narrowing as Jackson and his men held their ground. They're not as weak as I thought, Lyra muttered, watching the human soldiers with growing interest. Serena's smile faltered for the first time since arriving. No, they're not. The humans, against all odds, were proving themselves to be more resilient than the Zerathians had anticipated. The sky was painted with streaks of energy bolts and gunfire as the battle raged on. Dust clouds billowed in the wind, obscuring the horizon as the Zerathian warriors pressed their assault on the human forces. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert, but the light from the Zerathians' advanced weapons lit up the battlefield like a surreal, alien storm. Serena led the charge, her movements fluid and precise, her violet eyes fixed on the human soldiers scrambling for cover. Her plasma rifle hummed in her hands, unleashing controlled bursts of energy that disintegrated anything they touched. She hadn't expected the humans to hold their ground this long, and it was beginning to frustrate her. Behind her, Lyra moved with the same deadly grace, her eyes scanning the battlefield for weaknesses. She, too, had underestimated the humans. Their weapons were primitive, but they fought with a tenacity that caught the Zerathians off guard. These weren't the weak, cowering creatures they had imagined. These were soldiers, trained, disciplined, and ready to die if necessary. "General," Lyra called out over the noise of battle, her voice steady but carrying an edge of concern. "Their defenses are stronger than we anticipated. Should we adjust our strategy?" Serena's jaw clenched as she dodged a spray of bullets, her mind racing. She had been so sure of a quick victory, but now she realized the humans had more fight in them than she had expected. They had adapted quickly, using the desert's natural cover to their advantage, and their leader, a grizzled man Serena had noticed barking orders from the front lines, was no fool. Still, they were humans, and she was a Zerathian. There was no question of who would win, only how long it would take. "We continue the assault," Serena ordered, her voice cold and commanding. "They'll break soon enough." Lyra nodded but didn't seem entirely convinced. She knew Serena was determined to crush these humans, but there was something about their resilience that made her uneasy. Meanwhile, Sergeant Jackson and his men were holding their own against impossible odds. Jackson had seen combat before, but nothing like this. The Zerathians were faster, stronger, and more technologically advanced than anything he had ever encountered. But he had also never faced an enemy that looked so human. Despite their alien armor and blue skin, there was a familiarity to their movements, their tactics. Private Harris crouched beside Jackson, reloading his rifle with trembling hands. "Sarge, these things are unstoppable. What are we even doing here?" Jackson kept his eyes on the enemy, his mind running through every tactical scenario he could think of. "We're doing what we always do." "Harris, hold the line. They might be tough, but they're not invincible." He watched as another Zerathian warrior advanced, dodging through a hail of bullets with inhuman speed. Jackson's eyes narrowed as he took aim, tracking her movements. With a calm, steady hand, he squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck the Zerathian in the shoulder, sending her spinning to the ground. She wasn't dead, but she was out of the fight. "See?" Jackson said, glancing at Harris. "They bleed just like we do." Harris nodded, a flicker of hope in his eyes. The Zerathians might have the upper hand, but they weren't invincible. If they could just hold out a little longer, maybe they could turn the tide. On the other side of the battlefield, Serena watched as one of her warriors fell, wounded but not defeated. A flare of anger rose in her chest. How dare these humans defy them? How dare they fight back when they should be surrendering? With a snarl, she raised her rifle and fired a powerful blast at the human's cover. shattering a rock formation and sending debris flying in all directions. But as the dust cleared, she saw Jackson and his men still standing, their determination unshaken. For the first time, Serena felt something other than disdain for the humans. She felt respect. These soldiers were unlike the cowardly creatures she had expected to find. They fought with honor, with bravery, and despite her desire to crush them, she couldn't help but admire their resolve. Lyra approached, her expression grim. "They're not giving up. General, we may need to—" "Enough," Serena snapped. "We are Zerathians. We do not retreat." Lyra hesitated, then nodded. Understood. But even as Serena issued orders to press the attack, a part of her mind was turning over a new thought. The humans were stronger than she had anticipated. Yes, but more than that, there was something intriguing about them, something that called to the warrior in her. She had never encountered an enemy that fought with such spirit, such determination. And then there was their leader. Serena's eyes narrowed as she focused on Jackson, still barking orders, still standing tall despite the chaos around him. He was different from the others, stronger, more composed. There was something about him that caught her attention, something that made her want to learn more. But there was no time for that now. The battle wasn't over yet. As the Zerathians regrouped for another assault, Jackson and his men prepared for what they knew would be their hardest fight yet. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and outmatched, but they weren't giving up. And neither was Serena. The battle between human and Zerathian continued, each side refusing to yield. But as the night deepened and the stars shone down on the desert, it became clear to both sides that this conflict was no longer just about survival. It was about something more. And as Serena locked eyes with Jackson across the battlefield, she knew that whatever happened next, it would change everything. The battle continued through the night, with neither side willing to give an inch. Energy blasts lit up the dark sky, accompanied by the deafening sounds of gunfire and explosions. The human soldiers fought valiantly, using every bit of cover the rugged terrain offered, while the Zerathian warriors pressed forward, their superior technology giving them an undeniable edge. But no matter how fierce the assault, the humans didn't break. Serena, leading her squad from the front, had grown restless. The humans' persistence gnawed at her. What was it about them that made them refuse to surrender? She admired their courage, but it was beginning to irritate her. They were supposed to be weak, outmatched. Yet every time she thought she had them on the ropes, they found a way to hold on. As dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting a faint glow across the battlefield, Serena found herself separated from her squad. The dust from the previous skirmish hung in the air like a thick fog, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Her armor, glowing faintly with the soft pulse of Zerathian technology, stood out in the dim light, making her a beacon in the desolation. Suddenly, she heard a noise, a faint rustle in the rocks nearby. Her instincts kicked in, and she swung her plasma rifle around, ready to fire. But before she could react, a figure stepped out of the haze, and she froze. It was the human leader, Sergeant Jackson. He stood just a few paces away, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his body tense but not in a battle stance. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. They were alone, surrounded by the aftermath of war, with no other soldiers in sight. Both warriors held their ground, neither making a move. Serena's finger hovered over the trigger of her weapon, but something stopped her from firing. She had seen him on the battlefield, had watched him command his men with precision and bravery. Now, seeing him up close, she couldn't help but feel that same strange pull she had felt the night before. Jackson was the first to break the silence. "Looks like we're both a little lost," he said, his voice calm but guarded. His eyes flicked to her plasma rifle, then back to her face. "Though I'd say you've got the advantage here." Serena narrowed her eyes but didn't respond immediately. She studied him, noting the fatigue in his posture, the dirt and blood that covered his uniform, the way his jaw clenched as if he was ready for anything. He wasn't afraid of her, and that intrigued her even more. "What are you?" Serena finally asked, her voice sharp but laced with curiosity. "You fight like no human I've ever encountered." Jackson raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "I could ask you the same. You and your people, You don't exactly fight like any enemy we've faced before. Serena lowered her rifle slightly, though she kept her guard up. We are Zerathians. We do not yield. Our technology, our tactics, everything we do is superior. Superior? Huh? Jackson nodded, his tone thoughtful. You may have the tech, but we've got heart. And as far as I can tell, that's why we're still standing. Serena didn't respond, but his words lingered in her mind. The Zerathians prided themselves on their strength and dominance. But these humans, these stubborn, resilient creatures, had shown a different kind of strength. One that Serena was beginning to respect, even if she wouldn't admit it. Why are you fighting us? Jackson asked, his voice breaking the silence again. What do you gain from all of this? Serena frowned, caught off guard by the question. We were sent to conquer, she replied. Her tone clipped. To expand our empire and claim new territories. It is our way. Jackson shook his head, his expression hardening. And what happens when you conquer? What happens to the people who live here? They become part of the Zerathian Empire, Serena said, though the words felt hollow as she spoke them. They are given a chance to serve. To serve? Jackson repeated, his voice thick with disdain. That's just another word for enslave. Serena's eyes flashed, but before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the dust. Both she and Jackson tensed, turning toward the noise. Emerging from the fog of battle were two Zerathian guards, their weapons drawn. They spotted Serena and approached, their faces hidden behind sleek helmets. One of them, taller than the other, spoke first. General Serena, we've been searching for you. Are you unharmed? Serena straightened, her military demeanor slipping back into place. I'm fine, she said, her voice cold and authoritative. The guard's gaze shifted to Jackson, and his posture stiffened. A human? His hand twitched toward his weapon, but Serena raised her hand, stopping him. He's unarmed, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Leave him. The guards exchanged glances but obeyed, lowering their weapons slightly. Serena didn't know why she had stopped them. She had no reason to spare Jackson, but something in her gut told her this encounter was important. Jackson looked at her, a mixture of surprise and confusion on his face. Why? Serena didn't answer. She didn't know the answer herself. With a curt nod, she turned away, motioning for her guards to follow. We're returning to base, she said, her voice hard again. But as she walked away, leaving Jackson behind, her mind was racing. Why had she spared him? Why had she let him live? Jackson watched as Serena disappeared into the fog, the tension slowly easing from his body. He couldn't understand what had just happened. But one thing was clear. This war wasn't just about weapons and territory anymore. Something deeper was at play. And as he watched the Zerathians retreat, a strange feeling settled in his chest. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. This wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. The battlefield had quieted. The morning sun peeked through the haze, casting long shadows across the wreckage of the previous night's skirmish. Jackson made his way back to his unit, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. He couldn't shake the image of Serena, her imposing figure, the way she had hesitated to pull the trigger, and that strange look in her eyes before she turned away. When Jackson finally reached his camp, his fellow soldiers greeted him with a mix of relief and surprise. Sergeant, we thought we lost you, one of them exclaimed, clapping him on the back. Jackson gave a tired nod, waving off their concerns. Had a run-in with a few of the Zerathians, he said, downplaying the encounter, but he couldn't tell them everything. Not yet. How could he explain that he'd been spared by the enemy's general, that she had looked at him not with contempt, but with something else? He wasn't even sure what to call it. As Jackson sat down to rest, his thoughts drifted back to Serena. Who was she? Really? What made her different from the other Zerathians he had fought? And why, in the middle of this brutal war, had she let him live? Meanwhile, back at the Zerathian base, Serena was wrestling with her own questions. Her command tent was quiet, save for the faint hum of the technology that surrounded her. She stood at a sleek, black table displaying holographic maps of Earth's terrain, her mind replaying the encounter with Jackson over and over. She had never hesitated before, Not in all her years as a warrior. Conquest was simple. The Zarathian Empire expanded by force, and those who resisted were eliminated. It was their way. It had always been their way. So why had she stopped? Her second-in-command, Lieutenant Zane, entered the tent. His face set in the usual rigid expression of a Zarathian soldier. "General," Zane began, bowing slightly in respect, "we've completed a preliminary report on the last engagement. The humans fought with more tenacity than anticipated, but their resources are depleting. It won't be long before they fall." Serena didn't respond right away. Her eyes remained fixed on the holographic map. Though her thoughts were miles away, Zane noticed the unusual silence and hesitated. "General?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. "Is something wrong?" Serena's eyes flicked up to meet his. For a moment, she considered telling him about Jackson, about what had happened in the dust and chaos of battle. But something stopped her. She couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. Not when her people were on the verge of victory. "No," she said finally, her voice firm but distant. "Nothing is wrong. Continue the operation as planned." Zane gave a crisp nod and turned to leave. But before he could, Serena spoke again. "Lieutenant," she said, her tone softer this time, "the humans, they fight with more than just weapons. They fight with something else. What do you think drives them?" Zane stopped, frowning slightly. The question was unusual, but he didn't question his superior's line of thought. "I believe they fight out of desperation," he replied, carefully choosing his words. "They know they cannot win, but they fight because it is all they have left." Serena nodded slowly. Though Zane's answer didn't satisfy her, she dismissed him with a wave, and he left the tent without another word. Once alone, Serena stared at the map again, but her thoughts were no longer on strategy or battle plans. They were on Jackson, the human who had looked at her not as an enemy, but as an equal. The human who had fought with such resilience, such determination. She shook her head, trying to clear her mind. There was no time for such distractions. The Empire had its eyes set on Earth, and it was her duty to lead her forces to victory. But still, something tugged at her, a question that refused to be silenced. Could there be more to these humans than she had been taught to believe? Later that night, Jackson was lying in his makeshift cot, staring up at the stars through the broken roof of the bunker. His thoughts kept drifting back to the Zarathian general. What was it about her that had made him hesitate in their encounter? He'd fought against her people for months, seen the destruction they had caused, and yet, standing face to face with her, something had changed. He couldn't shake the feeling that she had spared him deliberately. But why? Before he could dwell on it further, his radio crackled to life. The voice of one of his superiors came through, cutting through the stillness of the night. "Sergeant Jackson, report to command immediately." Jackson sighed, rubbing his tired eyes before pushing himself to his feet. He grabbed his gear and made his way through the camp to the command tent, where several officers were gathered around a flickering map display. The air inside was tense. "Sergeant," one of the officers said as Jackson entered, "we've intercepted a message. You'll want to hear this." Jackson frowned, stepping closer to the table as one of the technicians replayed the intercepted transmission. It was in the Zarathian language, but a translator had already transcribed it. General Serena requesting a temporary ceasefire. I will meet with the human leader. Terms of parley to be discussed." Jackson's heart skipped a beat at the name. Serena, the Zarathian general, she wanted to meet. "What's this about?" Jackson asked, keeping his voice steady. The lead officer shrugged. "Could be a trap. Could be a genuine offer. Either way, we can't ignore it." Jackson's mind raced. He had never expected this. A ceasefire? A meeting? With the enemy's general? The officer turned to Jackson, his expression serious. "You've had encounters with this Serena before. You know their tactics better than anyone. We want you to go, see what they're offering, and if it's a trap, well, you know what to do." Jackson nodded, though his mind was spinning. He would meet with Serena again, but this time, it wouldn't be on the battlefield. As the officers began to finalize the plans, Jackson stepped outside the tent. Taking a deep breath of the cool night air, the stars above twinkled faintly. distant and indifferent to the war raging below. He couldn't help but wonder, what was Serena's true motive? Was this really a step toward peace? Or something more dangerous? And as he stared up at the sky, one thought kept repeating in his mind. Whatever this meeting was, it would change everything. Jackson stood at the edge of the neutral zone. A barren, no man's land littered with the remnants of past battles. The air was still, the tension almost palpable. His breath came slow and steady as he scanned the horizon. His senses heightened. This wasn't the first time he had been sent into enemy territory, but it was the first time he was walking into a meeting with the enemy's highest-ranking officer, Serena, the Zarathian general who had spared his life. A few of his comrades stood behind him, their presence a silent assurance, though they were ordered to hang back. This meeting was meant to be one-on-one, a negotiation of sorts. If it was a trap, his team would intervene, but Jackson had to go in alone. In the distance, he saw movement. Serena emerged from the mist-like haze that always seemed to linger over the battlefield. Her tall, regal figure unmistakable, she walked with purpose, her posture straight and commanding. Behind her, a few Zarathian soldiers stood at attention, their eerie stillness adding to the surreal atmosphere. As she approached, Jackson felt the strange pull again, the curiosity that had gnawed at him since their last encounter. Why had she spared him, and what did she hope to achieve by calling this meeting? When Serena reached the center of the neutral zone, she stopped, her piercing eyes locking onto Jackson's. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. There was no immediate aggression, no threats exchanged, only a charged silence that seemed to hang in the air between them. Jackson was the first to break it. "Why?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "Why did you call this meeting? What's your game?" Serena's gaze didn't waver, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something he hadn't seen before. She glanced around at the barren landscape, as if weighing her words carefully. Before speaking, "There is no game. Human," she said, her tone measured but not cold. "This war has cost both sides more than we anticipated. We need to find a solution before there is nothing left to fight over." Jackson crossed his arms, skeptical. "And you think a ceasefire is the solution? After everything your people have done?" Serena's jaw tightened, but she didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she took a step closer, her voice lowering slightly, though it remained clear and direct. "This war. It was never supposed to escalate like this. Our empire sought resources. Yes, but we did not anticipate the level of resistance your people would put up. We underestimated your will to fight." Jackson narrowed his eyes. "And now you want peace? Just like that?" Serena didn't flinch. "I want to avoid annihilation. For both our people. My leaders are growing impatient. They will not hesitate to escalate further. And once that happens, there will be no turning back." For the first time, Jackson saw a hint of vulnerability in her expression. She wasn't just here on orders, there was something personal in her plea. He could sense it, though he wasn't sure what had driven her to this point. "What do you really want?" "Serena," he asked, dropping the formalities. "Why are you here, talking to me, when you could be preparing for your next attack?" Serena hesitated for just a moment, her eyes flicking to the ground before meeting his gaze again. When she spoke, her voice had softened, though it still carried the weight of her authority. "I want to understand," she said, surprising him with the admission. "Your people, your resilience. We were taught that humans were weak, inferior, easy to conquer, but that's not what I've seen. I've seen a species willing to fight to the last breath, willing to sacrifice everything for their home." Jackson felt a lump form in his throat at her words. She was seeing humanity not as a mere obstacle, but as something more complex, something worthy of respect. It was a sentiment he hadn't expected from a Zarathian general. Serena continued, her gaze unwavering. "I've fought many battles across the stars, seen countless worlds fall to our empire. But Earth, it's different. You're different." Jackson took a deep breath, trying to process what she was saying. There was an honesty in her voice that made him want to believe her. But he couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. "And what do you expect from me?" he asked, You think one meeting can stop this war? Serena's expression grew more serious. I think one meeting can begin a conversation. If we continue on this path, there will be no victor, only ruin. I am willing to take the first step, but I need to know if your people are willing to do the same. Jackson stared at her, weighing his options. He could refuse, walk away, and let the war continue. But something about Serena's words, about the way she had looked at him during their last encounter, made him pause. He took a step closer, his eyes locked with hers. And if I agree to this, what happens next? Serena held his gaze, her voice firm but with a trace of something softer beneath the surface. We discussed terms, a temporary ceasefire. For now, enough time to begin negotiations. If both sides are willing, perhaps we can find a way to coexist. Jackson considered her words carefully. He knew he couldn't make this decision alone. He'd have to bring it back to his superiors, and they would decide the next course of action. But standing here, face to face with the enemy's leader, he couldn't help but feel that this was a pivotal moment. He nodded slowly. I'll take your offer to command, but I can't promise anything. Serena inclined her head in acknowledgement. That's all I ask. They stood there for a few more moments, the weight of their conversation hanging heavy between them. There was no handshake, no formal agreement, just a shared understanding that something had shifted between them. As Jackson turned to leave, he glanced back at Serena, seeing her in a different light. She wasn't just a warrior or a conqueror. She was someone caught between duty and something deeper, someone who saw more in humanity than just an enemy to be defeated. And as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that their fates were now intertwined in a way neither of them had anticipated. The war wasn't over. But perhaps, for the first time, there was a chance for something else. Something more. The days following the meeting passed in a blur of activity. Jackson had returned to his base, presenting Serena's offer to the military council with a mixture of skepticism and hope. The initial reaction was predictably tense. His superiors were wary, after all. This was an alien enemy they had been fighting for years. The scars of war ran deep, and trust wasn't easily earned, but there was also a sense of exhaustion. Humanity had suffered greatly in the conflict, and even the most hardened generals recognized the value in at least considering an armistice. After several heated discussions behind closed doors, the council decided to allow for a brief ceasefire, one that could be revoked at the first sign of treachery. Now, standing on the bridge of a transport ship heading toward the neutral zone once again, Jackson could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He was accompanied by a small diplomatic team, tasked with opening the dialogue that just might end the war. His comrades remained guarded, but their eyes flickered with the same flicker of hope that had begun to grow in him. The Zerathians had agreed to a location for the talks, a space station orbiting a distant, desolate moon. The station had been an abandoned relic of the first interstellar conflicts, a cold, steel remnant of an earlier time, repurposed now as the setting for humanity's most crucial negotiation. As the ship approached the station, Jackson found himself staring out at the endless void of space. The stars twinkled in the distance, indifferent to the drama unfolding in their midst. He couldn't help but wonder what was going through Serena's mind. Their last meeting had left him with more questions than answers. There had been a brief, fleeting connection between them, something he couldn't fully define, but it lingered in his thoughts nonetheless. The ship docked with the station, the soft hum of the engines fading as the airlock hissed open. Jackson and his team stepped into the dimly lit corridors, their boots echoing on the metal floor. It was cold, sterile, and quiet, almost eerily so. Ahead of them, two Zerathian soldiers stood at attention, their tall, lithe forms silhouetted against the light from the docking bay. They were dressed in their traditional armor, sleek and dark, with faint blue lights pulsing along the seams. And between them, waiting with the same poised elegance he remembered, stood Serena. Her presence was commanding, yet there was an unmistakable calm about her. She nodded slightly as Jackson approached, her gaze lingering on him just a moment longer than protocol required. "Welcome," she said, her voice steady but not devoid of warmth. "We are ready to begin." Jackson returned the nod. "Let's get this started." They made their way to a large chamber near the station's center, where a long table had been set up. The walls were lined with screens displaying tactical information, and a map of the surrounding star systems rotated slowly in the background. On one side of the table sat the human delegation. On the other, Serena and her team of Zerathian officers. The room was filled with an uneasy silence as the two sides sized each other up. This was no battlefield, but the tension was palpable. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Serena leaned forward, her voice breaking the stillness. The terms are simple. We propose a temporary ceasefire of 30 planetary cycles. During that time, both sides will withdraw from contested territories and refrain from any aggressive actions. One of the human generals, a grizzled veteran of the war, narrowed his eyes. And what makes you think we can trust you? How do we know this isn't just a ploy to buy time for your forces? Serena met his gaze unflinchingly. You have no reason to trust us. But consider the alternative. If we continue down this path, neither of us will win. We will destroy each other. This is an opportunity to avoid that fate. Jackson watched the exchange carefully. Serena was as composed as ever, her calm demeanor never wavering, but there was something else beneath her words, an urgency that hadn't been there before. We've analyzed your fleet movements. Another human officer chimed in. You've taken heavy losses. Why negotiate now, when you could have pushed harder months ago? Serena's jaw tightened slightly. Because we are at a tipping point. We cannot afford to drag this war out indefinitely, and neither can you. This ceasefire benefits both of us. Jackson's eyes flicked to Serena, searching for the truth in her words. She had been honest with him before, and he wanted to believe she was being honest now. But trust was a fragile thing, especially in a situation like this. One of the Zerathian officers leaned forward, his voice sharp. This is not a negotiation of weakness. Our forces remain strong, but continuing this war will only result in mutual destruction. Serena held up a hand, silencing her subordinate. She looked at Jackson directly, her gaze unwavering. Jackson, you have seen the front lines. You know what is at stake. Tell your leaders, can you not see the value in stopping this? Even if only for a short time? Jackson hesitated for a moment, the weight of the question heavy on his shoulders. The lives of countless soldiers, both human and Zerathian, depended on what happened in this room. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady but filled with conviction. We need to stop this, even if it's temporary, even if it only buys us time to find another solution. This war has cost us all too much. The room fell silent again, but this time it was a different kind of silence, a contemplative one. The human general leaned back in his chair, his expression hard but thoughtful. We will consider your proposal. Serena inclined her head. That is all we ask. As the negotiations continued, Jackson found himself glancing at Serena more than once. There was something about her, a quiet strength, a determination that resonated with him. She wasn't just a warrior. She was a leader, someone who genuinely wanted to find a way out of the darkness they had all been thrust into. When the talks adjourned for the day, Jackson found himself walking beside Serena as they made their way out of the chamber. The station's dim lights cast long shadows on the walls as they moved through the corridors, the silence between them more comfortable than it had been before. I didn't think you'd come, Jackson said quietly. Serena glanced at him, her expression softening just slightly. I wasn't sure if you would either. They walked in silence for a moment longer before she spoke again, her voice low. I meant what I said. Jackson, I don't want this war to continue, but I need to know that you believe in this too. Jackson stopped, turning to face her. For a long moment, their eyes met, and in that instant, he understood the gravity of what she was asking, not just for peace, but for trust. I believe you, he said simply, and in that moment, the fragile alliance between them felt just a little bit stronger.